I think we can go ahead and get started with a roll call. It's 10:01 and we have until 11. Just a quick reminder before we take roll of who's on the line, that if folks could keep themselves muted when you're not speaking, that'll be helpful in minimizing any feedback. Also, we ask folks to keep the remarks to 2 to 3 minutes. We have the opportunity to hear from everyone on the call. So I'm going to get started with calling through the list of attendees. Do we have Dean Kristen from New Hampshire Housing?
Good morning. Good morning, Senator.
Morning, Dean.
Thanks, Dean. Do we have Kathy Kuhn from Families in Transition New Horizons?
Yes, I'm here. Good morning, everyone.
Kathy.
Hi, Kathy. And Josh Meehan from Teen Housing?
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Thanks, Josh. Do we have John Manning from Southwestern Community Services?
Yes, good morning, everyone.
Morning, John.
Thanks, John. Carmen Lorenz from Lakes Region Community Developers?
Good morning.
Morning.
Thanks, Carmen. Do we have Katie Remark from the New Hampshire Community Development Finance Authority?
Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Katie.
Thanks, Katie. Do we have Jeanne Shaheen from Tri-County CAP?
Good morning, Senator. Good morning, Madison.
Thanks, Jeanne. Michael Renke from the Nashua Soup Kitchen and Shelter?
Yep, I'm here. Good morning.
Morning.
Thanks, Michael. Alyssa Margolin from New Hampshire from Housing Action New Hampshire?
Yes, hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks, Alyssa. And Mary Jo Landry from the Berlin Housing Authority.
Morning.
Good morning, Mary Jo.
Thanks, Mary Jo. And we do have members of the press listening on. So on the line, we have Matt Burdett or George Pelletier with the Nashua Telegraph, Cecil Zahid from NHPR, Paul Hayes with the Caledonian Record, Megan Foley with the Keene Sentinel, Bob Sanders with the New Hampshire Business Review, a representative from WMUR, and Ethan DeWitt from the Concord Monitor. So with that, I'll hand it over to the Senator for opening remarks.
Well, thanks very much, Madison, and thank you so much to all of you for taking time to join me on this call. As all of you are so deeply engaged and understand, housing is a huge issue in New Hampshire. It was an issue before this pandemic, and sadly, it's become even more critical as the result of the pandemic. The New Hampshire eviction moratorium, as we know so well, ended on July 1st. So we know that we have a lot of folks in rental housing who are in desperate straits. We have folks who still can't afford to buy homes in New Hampshire because of the cost. And this is a crisis that I believe we need to address not just at the local and state levels, but also at the federal level. And as we look at another round of assistance from the federal government to help with the response to the pandemic, this is one of the areas where we clearly need to provide some help. And one of the things I'm interested in hearing from all of you this morning is what you're seeing, what you think we can do at the federal level to try and help address the challenges we're facing here in New Hampshire and across the country, and what's the best way to have that help come. I am particularly frustrated, as I'm sure a number of you are, with the fact that we are still waiting for guidance from Housing and Urban Development on the Emergency Solutions Grant that were funded in the CARES Act back in March. The fact that those dollars are still sitting at HUD in D.C. is extremely frustrating when we've got so many people who are in need. It's frustrating to me that we have still not taken up the HEROES Act, the legislation that the House passed to provide additional assistance for help with the pandemic. We've had some reluctance on the part of the leadership in the Senate from Senator McConnell to take up that package. Now, it does sound like there is beginning to be an effort to put together additional assistance in Washington when we get back. So I'm hopeful that that is the case, and what I want to do is to be able to advocate as strongly as I can for what you all collectively think we need to do. So, again, thank you very much for being on the call. I look forward to hearing what you have to say. In addition to Madison, who I think most of you on the call know, Sarah Holmes, my state director, is on the call, as is Ariel Marshall, who's my legislative director down in Washington, Pam Slack, again, who I'm sure most of you know, who's over in the Keene area, and Robert Hinson, who's been working on a lot of economic and business issues and will be working on budget kinds of things. So I think we've got a good staff lineup on to try and take notes so we can work on what we're hearing from you, our important priorities. So again, I look forward to hearing from you this morning.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to go through and call on each participant one at a time, and we're going to get started with Dean Kristen.
Thank you, Madison. Thank you, Senator. And Senator, I think you have touched on really the core issues that we're probably all very concerned about. The pandemic and the economic dislocation associated with that has clearly hit a lot of different individuals. Our sense is that renter households are among the hardest hit, particularly since particularly low-income renters are likely to have been in many of the employment categories that were most subject to dislocation early on in the hospitality industry, retail, service jobs. And so we're very concerned about the implications for that population of the reduction, the phasing out of the extra unemployment assistance combined with the lifting of the eviction ban. Now, we know that there's been an effort at the state level that John Manning and others will, I'm sure, speak to provide some resources, which I think is great, through the CARES Act. But I do suspect that we're going to need more resources down the line. That is probably going to be a bigger problem than it may immediately appear to people to be. I think it's been muted by the presence of the CARES Act, unemployment resources, and other factors in the short term. And so focus on providing some additional rental assistance resources through one of those mechanisms that you have spoken to, and I know you've been supportive of some of the legislation that would propose that already, I think would be very important, particularly in our environment where vacancy rates are so low, and once people become homeless as a result of eviction, if that happens, it is extremely difficult to rehouse them. And frankly, the homeless service sector, as I'm sure you hear as well from others, is already under enormous stress, and adding more people to that would not be in anybody's interest going forward. On the homeownership side, you've already alluded to the fact that we had a challenge in particularly finding opportunities for first-time and lower-income home buyers to access that market. That's just gotten a lot worse as the inventory has shrunk, as people have been reluctant to add their homes to the market, and we're still not building enough new housing in New Hampshire. Prices continue to rise there because of that pressure. And I think there's probably a similar problem to the eviction issue on the for sale side in terms of homeowners. It's just much more muted because of the very positive things that were done in the CARES Act with forbearance opportunities for people who have federally assisted mortgages, which we estimate to be probably 2/3 of mortgage holders in New Hampshire. But eventually, those things are going to have to be dealt with. And forbearance, as we know, means deferral. It does not mean forgiveness. And so people who have asked for forbearance on their mortgages will eventually have to settle up, if you will. And while the federal agencies have indicated that they're going to try to work with people, and I think that's a good thing, there's going to be a lot of support that's going to be necessary for a lot of people down the road, perhaps dollars for counseling, perhaps dollars for actual intervention to help people with back mortgage payments and things of that nature. And I know that there are resources in the HEROES Act, and there have been resources advanced in other legislation that you've been supportive of that would do that, and I think that's going to be really important going forward as well. And then finally, in the homeless area, we've been asked recently to use some CARES Act dollars to help support the homeless providers around the state, and we're gearing up to do that. I think that it's likely that that's going to be a long-term challenge. It is going to go beyond the end of this year, which is when the CARES Act money expires. And I guess if there's one specific ask that I would make there is that I think Congress needs to reflect on the deadlines for some of that CARES Act funding, particularly for things like providing resources for homeless shelters and some of these housing programs, expecting that all of our issues are going to be resolved by the end of December is probably a little overly optimistic given what we're seeing, and giving us some flexibility to use some of those resources beyond that date to continue to support people, even as you work on bringing new resources forward, I think would be very, very helpful. With that, I think I'll try not to monopolize the conversation and stop and see if I can answer any questions that you may have. And I will say that a number of the people that are going to speak after me are much more expert in some of these more specific areas than I, but we stand here ready to support their work and to engage with your staff as always, and to try to do what's best for New Hampshire.
Well, thanks very much, Dean. I think your point about looking at the expiration dates that are in the CARES Act is really important. I think when we passed that back in March, nobody had a clear picture of how long we were going to be dealing with this pandemic, and so it seems to me that should be one of the easier things for us to do. We've already done it in some of the small business programs to look at being more flexible with dates, and I think that will be very important. There is legislation that Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio has sponsored, that I'm co-sponsoring, that would create an emergency rental assistance fund to provide help for rental assistance for folks to pay their rent during the crisis. So hopefully some version of that will get into the next legislative package.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I appreciate your support for that. And I agree also that it ought to be relatively easy to move some of those dates. I would hope the deadlines in the CARES Act, I think that most folks who are looking at doing work in the housing space with CARES Act money are very troubled by the deadlines that we think we're going to have to work with, and so some relief there would be very, very valuable.
Yeah,
thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dean. Next, we have John Manning.
Thank you, Madison. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
First of all, I'd like to just a very quick thank you for your support in trying to fix the CSBG small state problem that we have, and trying to get it so that the funds can flow to New Hampshire that we deserve to help all the community action agencies really try to help the folks that are suffering through the COVID pandemic. So thank you for your support in writing that letter. Hopefully that will get fixed.
Yeah. We will continue to work on it until it does.
I appreciate that. That's critically important. I think Dean hit on a few of the good things. I think that certainly the dates are critical, and it would seem like no one knew, like you said, no one knew how long this was going to last and what's going to happen. From our perspective, we're currently, the CAPS are currently running the New Hampshire Housing Relief Program. It's going to hopefully help a lot of folks, many of which probably never needed assistance before, in being able to stay within their housing because of issues they're dealing with because of COVID. That's a good starting point. I think one of the areas, though, that we need to really work hard at is the shelters. There has been some short-term emergency funding that we've received to try to decompress the shelters. Having 12 people or 14 people living in a two-bedroom building, it used to make sense because housing them was the most important thing. But now the need is to get them decompressed, fewer people living in the shelter, so that they're able to deal with a health issue if someone does become sick or need to self-quarantine. So I'm hoping that we're going to be able to see more funds down the road to get more folks out of the shelters and into more permanent housing. Trying to get them out in the short term. We've opened up some new shelters in Cheshire County that have been able to allow us to move some folks, but the funding that was used to set those up is not something that we see continuing necessarily. So I'm hoping that as you look at the future assistance that you're going to put together, the goal of getting as many people as we can out of these homeless shelters and into permanent housing is really important, really critically important. It is just not a good health situation, not a good living situation for folks to be living in shelters. Families, children, even single individuals. So anything you can do to help try to continue the funding that's going to move more and more folks out of the shelters would be really appreciated.
thank you, a really important point.
Thank
And
you,
again,
John.
I would also just thank you again, Senator, for all your support that you do for the state in general. I think everybody on the call acknowledges you're there for us when we need you.
Well, thanks very much, John, and thank you that's a nice tribute to all of my staff who work so hard to try and respond to the needs that they hear out there.
Thank you, John. Next we have Kathy Kuhn.
Thank you, Madison, and thank you, Senator, for hosting this call and for all the great work and leadership on this really important issue. I would kind of echo a little bit of what John said. As one of the largest shelter providers for single individuals in the state, our biggest concern is the loss of shelter beds for people experiencing homelessness. So as an example, our capacity at New Horizons has been cut by more than half, from 138 beds pre-COVID to only 64 beds post-COVID. And as John mentioned, currently, we are thankful that the state has provided us with some support to stand up a second shelter, which does right now give us the ability to serve an additional 40 people. But we also have been informed that funding for decompression from the state is ending at the end of this month. So we are very concerned about how we're going to be able to consider or to continue the operation of this second shelter, because it is a pretty expensive endeavor. And even if we do get some of the ESG funds that will eventually become available, we don't anticipate getting enough to fully fund the second shelter. And of course, we also know that those funds are temporary. So we worry about long-term sustainability, especially as we, head into a recession. So we're trying to be as creative as we can in finding a solution, again, especially as we head into winter. But in a lot of ways right now are feeling like we don't really have that magic answer. And, that's really going to help us to sort of come up with a immediate and long-term solution to this problem. And I think in the short term, the need for shelter is going to remain. We just don't have enough supply of housing to get people out of the shelter quickly. I concur with John absolutely 100% that we need to get people into permanent housing. But at this point, I think the supply of affordable rental housing just isn't there, and so the need for shelter is going to remain. The other just quick thing that I will say is that, we all know that homelessness is very complicated. There are a lot of reasons why people don't want to come into the shelter environment, particularly during a time of pandemic. So what we're seeing in Manchester is that the number of people in encampments have increased. And one of the concerning trends that we're seeing at the same time now is that we're beginning to see our overdose numbers in the city tick up. So they had declined significantly during March and April, but in June, those numbers were sort of more on average with what we were seeing prior to the COVID-19 stay-at-home order. And so what we're seeing is that, the numbers of people who are able to access treatment or who are able to access recovery, housing, or transitional living programs is pretty low. And part of that is because a lot of programs have had to limit capacity. So an example is in our transitional living program, we've been sort of saving a room just in case we need to have someone to quarantine. So that's a room that's not available for someone who may need it. So I think, it's important that we remember that, these sort of SUD-related housing programs, as well as sort of the outpatient treatment programs that are so critical to people who are experiencing homelessness, are really going to need some support to ensure that those programs are remaining healthy and that they're available for the folks who need it to help them to establish stability and ultimately get into permanent housing.
So, Kathy, as you're seeing the overdoses begin to go up again, are people still able to access Safe Station and get into treatment programs, or are you seeing a reluctance to do that because of COVID?
Yeah, I think we are seeing a reluctance to do that. Definitely the numbers of people who are sort of accessing treatment is lower than what it was before COVID. So I do think that there is a reluctance, and hopefully that reluctance will slowly end as we move forward. But right now we are seeing numbers pretty low in treatment programs across the state, and that causes financial difficulty for these programs because they're unable to bill the fees that they need to operate the program.
Thank you, Kathy. Next, we have Josh Meehan.
Hi, thanks, Madison, and thank you, Senator, for having this call. And I just want to acknowledge that your staff has done a great job from the beginning of sort of reaching out to us all regularly and hearing from us and making sure that we feel heard, and we really appreciate that. I wanted to start off by just also thanking you for the CARES Act. From the Housing Authority's perspective, I think it went pretty well. We were able to use some of that supplemental funding to get our hands on some PPEs and disinfection machines, address some of our labor cost issues that are associated with keeping our properties clean and safe. And I also want to acknowledge HUD's waiver package that they put out soon after the CARES Act passed was actually quite helpful. And they've just extended it through the end of December. But like others on the call, I think the end of December isn't enough time. And I would just sort of add our voice to those urging you to think about extending those waivers for as long as possible, because it looks like this is going to be with us for a while. I did want to talk a little bit about some of the things that aren't working great for us yet. And unexpectedly, one of the big shortcomings for us are actually IT related, and specifically the limitations of broadband and high-speed internet access is making it difficult for our staff to work remotely. And it's also making it very difficult for us to communicate with our elderly and senior residents in particular. Because ordinarily we have a pretty robust resident services program, but we've had to stop all that stuff because we can't have, you can't have bingo right now. And so our resident service coordinators are kind of struggling a little bit with keeping in touch with our elderly and disabled residents. And then as we think about funding and resources available, one thing that I just wanted to call out was that the 28,000 people who are housed by housing authorities in New Hampshire are actually really lucky, because while they're low income, their rents fluctuate with their income. So those are sort of the 28,000 lucky people, but for each one of them, there's at least a handful of others who otherwise would be eligible for this housing, but there's simply not enough supply, so they don't have the access to it. So I would just encourage you to think about every opportunity there is through the appropriations process and any sort of supplemental appropriations related to emergency funding, that we think about ways to increase the supply of affordable housing for those people who need it, because we anticipate a wave of applications coming shortly, and we really have no means to meet that wave currently.
Yeah, totally. I mean, as all of you know, this is a short-term problem, the crisis, but it's a longer-term problem as we look at how do we make more affordable housing available to people. There is legislation that's bipartisan. Again, I'm co-sponsoring it with Senators Cantwell and Young to expand the low-income housing tax credit to try and encourage more development of affordable housing. And again, it's not clear if we'll be able to get this done as part of legislative activity over the next couple of months, but what we really need is a program like that can try and encourage more development of affordable housing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in the shorter term, in the HEROES Act, there was something that looks a lot like the Disaster Housing Assistance Program that Congress, you might remember when there's hurricanes, is typically when it's used. That short-term voucher program, I mean, this clearly is an emergency, a nationwide emergency, and I think the language in the HEROES Act, if there were a way to preserve that or move it forward, would at least provide some shorter-term assistance to people who are going to need it.
I agree, and what we need is for, as I said, for the leadership in the Senate to take up, if not the HEROES Act in total, provisions in the HEROES Act that are going to be so critical as we look at how we continue to help people through this period. And also, as I and so many others have been saying, in order to get the economy back up and running, we've got to address some of these other underlying issues, because we're not going to be able to get back to where we were unless we've addressed some of the issues like housing that you all know so well.
Absolutely. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Next, we have Carmen Lorenz.
Good morning. Thank you, Senator, for the opportunity to participate in this call. I appreciate it. I'm from Lakes Region Community Developers. We're based up in Laconia, and we develop affordable housing. We've been around for 27 years. Right now, we've got 365 affordable apartments in 6 different towns in the Lakes region. What we're seeing is, we've about 60% of our apartments, either the household or the apartment itself, has some kind of rental subsidy. We have several properties that have the USDA rental assistance subsidy, and then about 20% of our other renters who live in other units have a housing choice voucher. That's been tremendously helpful for those families because we've been able to do a lot of unscheduled recertifications to adjust their subsidy for those that have lost income due to work. So that's been really important, and I think continuing to ensure that there are rental subsidy funds available both through HUD and USDA is going to help a lot of people. I would say at this point, we're seeing about 10% of our households that are really struggling, and honestly, a lot of them were struggling before COVID, but now they're just falling further and further behind on rent and building up, some of them, quite a large past due rent balance. But because we have so much rental subsidy in our portfolio, we're actually doing okay in terms of rent collections. So far, I would say that the CARES Act funding has been extremely effective. We've definitely seen our tenants using the stimulus, both using the stimulus checks that they got to pay off some past due balance and using the enhanced unemployment benefits to do what they can to stay current on rent. But we're hearing from a lot of families that, they have a lot more expenses because they're all at home all the time with the kids, more costs for food, electricity. So that's digging into what they can pay for rent. But so far, I think the stimulus has been really effective, and we're very grateful for that because we were really worried at the beginning. We had no idea what was going to happen, but things are okay right now. I think we're just really nervous about what happens after the end of this month. We're really planning on having some significant impacts to our portfolio for probably the next 18 to 24 months at least. And we're definitely concerned about being able to continue producing affordable apartments and starter homes, which is something that we are trying to do. Making sure that the low-income housing tax credit market is still working in terms of us being able to get good pricing on those credits when we do have a project that we put together. That's really important because if the price for the credits down, then we need more subsidy, like from the home program or CDBG. So I think those are definitely concerns going forward. And I think we've also kind of been dipping our toes into developing permanent supportive housing, and we do run a small program that takes families who are coming out of homelessness from our local shelters. And, that's kind of a different animal because we're not able to place those families into most of our units. We're only able to put them in our older units that don't have any more compliance that they have to contend with, really, because these families typically don't fit the requirements of those programs. So I think special funding for permanent supportive housing is what's needed to ensure that we have places for folks to go when they're ready to move out of the shelter, because they're often not a good fit with our USDA or LIHTC units.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, Carmen? What are the challenges there? People don't have full-time jobs, or they don't have money to put down for deposits. What's the bigger issue there?
Usually it's that they have really bad landlord references, so they don't pass the background check. Sometimes, we do have a provision in our tenant selection plan where we can waive that if need be, but we're required to do criminal background checks, landlord checks, and the credit check. And so it's usually one or more of those issues that trips people up. And then in addition, if it's just a straight, LIHTC with maybe some home subsidy, it's actually, a relatively narrow band of the market that those units can serve, because if they're reserved for people at 50% or 60% of the area median income, the family has to have enough income where they can demonstrate they can pay the rent, but they can't have too much that they're over the income limit. And a lot of the families that we see that are coming out of homelessness, they don't have enough income to demonstrate that they can pay the rent. So unless they have a housing choice voucher, which in Belknap County can take, up to a year to get one, they're sort of in that limbo space where they can't demonstrate sufficient income to pay the rent, but they're on the wait list for the voucher. And so in the meantime, they don't really have anywhere to go.
So as we're thinking about how to address that need, the biggest issue is just a separate pot of money that can help with that particular challenge as we're trying to help families get out of homeless shelters.
Yes, I think if we had funding to build more permanent supportive housing, that could serve as a transitional, path. And also if there were if there was more voucher funding available so that people didn't have to wait quite so long to get a voucher. I know outside of Belknap County, the wait list is much longer. So we actually find families in the Laconia area fare a little better because they only have to wait, 9 to 12 months for a voucher versus several years if you're outside of Belknap County.
Great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. Next is Katie Easterling-Marte.
Hi, all. Thank you very much. I just want to thank all of the staff at Senator Shaheen's office and the senator, as well as the nonprofits. I think one of the things that we really know, but that has just been illuminated to us over the last couple of months, was just the strength of the nonprofit sector in New Hampshire, and the amount that we rely on that sector to both house the most vulnerable and to create new housing opportunities, whether those be shelter opportunities, supportive housing, decompression in this circumstance, or new affordable units. And while there's significant resources to support those nonprofits, I think that some of the significance of the revenue loss that we've really been evaluating as the administrator of funding for them, ongoing capacity concerns, need for technical assistance, and need for planning for sustainability when the future revenue is unclear based on particularly nonprofit housing developers who have a significant rental portfolio. It makes us very concerned about whether we'll be able to continue to have the slow momentum towards solutions, housing solutions that we were seeing. So I really was excited about the participation in things like the Council for Supportive Housing Institute that New Hampshire Housing ran, and that had really significant participation. In New Hampshire, we have a high proportion of nonprofit housing developers as opposed to for-profit housing developers. And those nonprofit housing developers really came forward to figure out how to, as Carmen talked about, create additional housing opportunities, particularly permanent supportive housing, which we know is so necessary. But then I think just about the current financial position of so many of those nonprofits, and worry, will we be able to continue to have them creating solutions, being at risk for all the financial uncertainty that comes with holding a property for years before it's able to be developed, which is the reality in our state with land so expensive for development. And I just think that while we've done a lot to support nonprofits, I really hope that any future funding can include continued support, because I think with the state budget estimated revenues, that continued support for that sector is going to be really necessary to create long-term solutions like decompression opportunities, and to be sure that we don't, that we make some strides forward in these. I think you really were, everybody has been really clear that these are long-term issues, and that have just been exacerbated by our current situation. And it would be really important, I think, to just continue to both meet the immediate needs, but also hope that our nonprofits have the ability through stabilized revenue to be thinking about long-term solutions as well, and hopefully building additional permanent affordable housing units and permanent supportive housing units. A couple of things that we're struggling with specifically, so in the administration of the community development block grant dollars, particularly the CV funds, there hasn't been any guidance from HUD. So we've been told that there will be some of the requirements of the disaster relief funds on the CDBG CV funds, like the duplication of benefit, just as an example, where you actually have to calculate and ensure there's not overlap of funding. But we actually don't have, so that's one of the things that's more administratively complicated for using disaster relief funds usually, and in this case, the CDBG CV. But unfortunately, HUD has not determined that these funds will just be treated like disaster relief funds. So some of the flexibility that's also provided administratively with DR funds does not exist with the CV. So we're getting additional restrictions without clear guidance on how to implement those restrictions, because they actually haven't given guidance. They just said it will be a requirement. And then we're not receiving the flexibility. And one of those most significant pieces of flexibility, I think particularly in New Hampshire, a state that relies on nonprofits to provide public services, support services and housing, is the ability to grant directly to nonprofits. So we continue to need to administer those funds through municipalities. And unfortunately, our municipalities are just so overburdened with all of their own responsibilities. A municipality I talked to recently said that they didn't have an emergency department being able to do emergency preparedness. So their town planner was taking on that work at about 60 hours a week. So the idea that that same town planner will be able to apply for funding that would support a nonprofit to create housing or to provide salaries and other needed support for homeless shelters, it's sort of an uphill battle. So I just urge you to continue, and I know you have, to ask HUD to provide guidance so that we can successfully administer the funds that have already been awarded, and hope to work with you to really provide good information of where we are seeing gaps for nonprofits, and hope to really be able to provide additional resources so that they can continue to do the great work that's necessary right now in the relief and then in the recovery phase as well.
Thank you, Katie. You know, one of the debates that I'm anticipating that will be challenging in this next round of funding is how much support is going to go to state and local governments. As some of you may remember, when we did the CARES Act, it's one of the things that held up the act. The reason New Hampshire got that $1.25 billion is because we held out to make sure that states and local communities got funding, because they're on the front lines of dealing with this pandemic. And so to try and address the kind of issue that you're raising, we really do need to continue to provide support for municipal governments, so that both so that they don't have to lay people off, but so that they can deal with some of these emergency needs. And the waiver that you're talking about is one of the things that we ought to work on. And anything that you all can do to encourage your programs in other states to support funding for state and local governments, I think, will be really important. One of the reasons New Hampshire's been able to allocate funds in certain areas that we weren't able to get directly into the CARES packages because of that separate funding resource. And that's, I think, really going to be critical in the next package of legislation.
Thank you, Katie. Next, we have Jeannie Robillard from Tri-County CAP.
Well, hello, good morning, Senator. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to meet with all of us and, pick our brains, so to speak, on what's needed. And in particular, I'm going to echo what John Manning had to say about your support of CSVG. Those funds are going to be very important for the CAP going forward as we, partner with other nonprofits in trying to fill some of the gaps that we see happening in our local communities. So your support has been fantastic. Thanks so much for making that happen. And as far as the North Country goes, I reiterate a lot of things that folks already said. That's one of the drawbacks of being, down the line to talk. But mostly, also wanted to reiterate that the extended deadline, I think particularly for the North Country, is going to be important. We are so tourism-based, and so many folks are out of work because there simply is no work. And up here, people have their summer job, and then they have their winter job when the, ski season and winter sports industry kicks in. And if we're getting a second wave come the fall, we anticipate that there are going to be even more folks looking for assistance that have not accessed, a CAP program before, even in terms of, fuel assistance, the housing, et cetera. So I think extending those deadlines is going to be very, very important. And I think that's pretty much it. Also up here, we're very, very committed to keeping people housed. So, the CARES Act funding that we're getting for the housing is really important. Housing is scarce. So it is really a bad thing when somebody loses their housing. It can be very difficult to get them turned over and rehoused quickly. So this program has been very, very helpful. And also wanted to add in, along with Kathy, the need for permanent supportive housing. That's really essential up here, particularly in the North Country. Folks don't have a lot of options. We have very little shelter beds. And so, getting more programs, being able to staff them appropriately so that we make sure that once we get someone into housing, we are able to work with that individual, work with their landlord, get them hooked up to, the other community supports that they need so that they will successfully maintain that housing. That's really important. And other than that, just keep up the great work, Senator. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Jeanne, for all you do.
Thank you, Jeanne. Next, we have Michael Reinke from the National Soup Kitchen and Shelter.
Hi. Again, thank you so much for giving all of us the opportunity to, share a little bit of our experience and observations. I'm not going to say this, but this wasn't always a problem. In 1970, the United States had a surplus of 300,000 affordable rental units. Under the Reagan administration, the spending dropped from annually $32 billion to $7 billion. What we're experiencing today is the long-term disinvestment in affordable housing. There's a lot of issues here I could talk about. I want to focus specifically on the U.S. Interagency Council on the Homeless and the continuum of care application process. As it was originally conceived back in the 1990s with Secretary Como, it's not functioning in that manner. It is, for all intents and purposes, broken. It used to be a source of funding to help provide support for various creative programs to help people experiencing homelessness, like street outreach, housing navigators. Here at the National Soup Kitchen and Shelter, we used to have an employment and training program, which was also funded out of that funding support. Today, the continuum of care process is essentially a source of funding for what is a second Section 8 program targeting the chronically homeless population very much in need, but still only 20% of all the people who experience homelessness in a given year. So from my perspective, a couple of recommendations would be to say take the permanent supportive housing program out of the continuing care process and put it into a specific housing choice section, put it into the housing choice Section 8 program. This will provide flexibility. This will, again, give them the Section 8 renewal, and then will allow the continuing care process to fund the innovative necessary programs beyond just doing the renewals every year. Fund innovation, co-housing projects. So we're trying a pilot project here in Nashua where we have rented with the support of the New Hampshire Housing Authority. We've rented a 3-bedroom unit apartment where we are now subleasing to people who have some income. You know, maybe it's $500 a week, maybe it's their Social Security check, and then they are renting a room, unrelated, but they're renting a room together, and so we're moving them out of the shelter much more quickly, whereas in the past they might stay there for a month or two, or even longer. Support scattered site and rental subsidies up to 24 months. One suggestion might be also developing an equity fund. So people who own their homes get the equity of their house. Think about how can we try to provide an equity fund for people who are in rental housing. Increase the amount of workforce development. That's something which is almost absent from much of what HUD is providing for people experiencing homelessness right now. And then finally, and this is critical, it used to be that the continuum care process was an opportunity and a process to listen to people experiencing homelessness and including them in the decision. Far too often, those voices are currently left out of the decision-making process. And so bringing them back to the table, I think, is critical.
Great. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Next, we have Mary Jo Landry from the Berlin Housing Authority.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to underline in Christian's point about expiration dates for the current legislation that's in effect FICAP. Had a really good about it. It's going to be difficult for us to get everything we need to get done within the deadline, and to also emphasize the request that was made for HUD to give more clarification on the definition use of the COVID-related subsidies, which seems to be slowly coming forth and not as quick as we would like. And other than that, many of my other concerns have been well forth. So that before I.
Good. Thank you, Mary. Mary Jo, you were sort of breaking up, so I wasn't sure if we got everything that you said. I think you finished by saying the other issues that you were planning to raise have already been mentioned by others.
Yes, and I can follow up with an email to Madison.
That'd be great.
Understand it's pouring here, so that could be having an effect on any kind of transmission. So sure.
You're having the thunderstorms that we're going to get soon.
Yes, we are.
Good. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Mary Jo. And finally, we have Alyssa Margolin from Housing Action, New Hampshire.
Thanks. I want to add my gratitude, Senator, to you and your staff for your constant attention to the affordable housing issue. As you noted, when you kicked off the call this morning, it's been an issue for a while. And I think the pandemic really unveiled the fragility in our housing market. There was one thing to kind of note the supply side shortage, that a balanced rental market should have a vacancy rate of 4 to 5%. We were at 0.75 and seeing rents skyrocketing. But it was another thing during the pandemic to realize that if someone was really facing eviction, that they really had very little choice. And so I think that's why I'd like to underscore some of the pipeline programs. And it's great to hear that you have co-sponsored the tax credit bill, programs like home, taking a look at the bill in the House, the Moving Forward Act, that deals with housing as an infrastructure issue that includes significant funding for public housing capital, National Housing Trust Fund. As Carmen noted earlier, we understand that shelters are not the solution, and we would like to see more permanent supportive housing, and the trust fund, the National Housing Trust Fund, could be a key tool. But we need it with rental assistance, because if we expand that pool, we need to expand the rental assistance pool. And Dean and other housing authorities have done a great job of project-based vouchers when they can, but they're essentially taking from the same pie. And so, the need to actually increase the number of vouchers available is important. And finally, I think I'll close by just adding my voice to this issue around the December 30th deadline. I think there's an argument to be made that for the homeless shelter funding in particular, that there really should just be an exception. To be homeless during the pandemic at any point is arguably a crisis, since there's no safe place really to isolate, socially distance, or quarantine in a shelter. And we know that we have major infrastructure needs in our shelter system, in our state and around the country. And it's just, it doesn't make any sense really to, set aside this funding to do infrastructure improvements and then, only to realize that we just don't have time to do them by this deadline.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that, Alyssa. The fact, and again, it goes back to the fact that nobody had any idea at the time we passed the CARES Act how long this was going to go on, and so now we need to go back and look at those deadlines and make sure they're consistent with what we now know about this pandemic and how long it's lasting.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. And I think your point about including housing in any infrastructure package is absolutely critical. The point Michael made, and I remember when the Reagan administration made the dramatic cuts to housing and what happened as a result of that. So we've got to recognize that as we're looking at investments in infrastructure going forward, that housing is a critical piece of that, and it should be included in whatever we do. So hopefully it may help make that happen.
Thank you, Alyssa. Senator, do you have any closing remarks?
I do. I know that we lost Melissa Hatfield, and nobody from the Bureau of Housing Supports was able to join. Is that correct? Because at one point we thought they might have someone else join us.
I haven't heard from Melissa, but is anyone else from BHS on the line? Doesn't sound like they were able to join, Senator.
Good. Well, again, I just want to thank you all very much for the conversation this morning. You provided a number of very helpful suggestions as we're looking at another round of assistance for people and thinking about what should be included in that. I got loud and clear the message: we got to provide more flexibility, and we need investments in some places that were maybe not covered in that first CARES package. And we also need to continue to push HUD to issue this guidance so that the dollars can go out. It's been, as I said in my opening remarks, one of my frustrations, and sadly, HUD has not been the only challenge. There have been some other agencies, but HUD seems to have been the most delinquent in getting out guidance that can allow agencies to use the dollars that were appropriated to provide the help. So we will continue to work on that, and I hope that all of you will continue to share with us. If you have other ideas going forward, you know how to reach Madison, you know how to reach Sarah and our office in New Hampshire and DC. And we will be, as I said, when we get back from the 4th of July break, when we are in our states, which is not next week, but the following week, we will have, I'm hoping we will take up a legislative package and provide additional assistance, and that will be an opportunity to include and fight for many of the suggestions that you all have mentioned. So thank you for that very much. Thank you for what you continue to do to support people throughout the state during this difficult time. And I look forward to continuing to work with you as we try and address the issues that you've raised this morning. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator.